Welcome to this meeting on the situation in South Sudan. My name is Gunn Elisabeth Birkeland, and I am Secretary General at the Academy, and I will chair this webinar. In recent years, a number of dramatic events have shown that we cannot take democracy for granted. Societies face major challenges. To mention a few, the climatic crisis, increasing socioeconomic inequalities in many countries, and increasing political polarization. We also see increasing migration across countries and continents. And in many societies, freedom of expression is under pressure. In addition, the ongoing pandemic represents dilemmas in terms of how societies and governments might combat the virus and its mutations. To address these challenges and threats to democracy, the Academy has started a webinar series this year that sheds light on what democracy is, its preconditions, consequences, and challenges. We engage prominent researchers and politicians to discuss these issues in a form that we hope can reach beyond the Academy's own ranks. And we will summarize the contributions in an anthology to be published next spring. Today, we address the situation in South Sudan. According to the United Nations, the war in South Sudan has killed around 400,000 people. If the parties do not find a solution quickly, the war could get even worse. But what exactly is the conflict in South Sudan about? What are the driving forces that sustain the war? This meeting will discuss the precarious political, humanitarian, and human rights situation in South Sudan, the lack of preconditions for democracy in the country, and the possibility of holding the country's leaders responsible for human rights violations and war crimes. Norway has been heavily involved in South Sudan for decades. And since Norway now is a member of the United Nations Security Council, Norway could take responsibility for putting the conflict on the agenda of the Security Council. To discuss this, we today have a panel with 4 speakers and thereafter 3 prepared commentators. The panel includes Anders Breidlid, Tom Christiansen, Regina Guy, and Cecilia Hellestvedt, and they will have 10 minutes each. The commentators are Hilde Frafjord Jonsson, Peter Natana, and Marit Hernes, and they will have 5 minutes each. So then I'm pleased to introduce the first speaker, Anders Breidlid. He is a professor at Oslo Metropolitan University and has previously worked for Norwegian Church Aid in South Sudan. He is the author and editor of the first history book on South Sudan, A Concise History of South Sudan. So please, Anders Breidlid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, or maybe evening. I will give a brief presentation of South Sudan's history since independence. South Sudan gained independence from Sudan on July 9, 2011, 6 years after the devastating civil war ended between Northern Sudan with the National Congress Party and Southern Sudan under the leadership of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and Army, SPLM, a war that had lasted for well over 50 years from 1954 with certain intermissions, one of the longest civil wars in history. I was present on Independence Day on July 9th, 2011, and experienced the euphoria and optimism that day in Juba, the capital of South Sudan. Unfortunately, optimism was short-lived. As early as in 2013, there was full division within the government of South Sudan, and the division degenerated into full civil war between President Salva Kiir of SPLM and Vice President Riek Machar, who formed the SPLM in opposition. Both sides in the conflict targeted civilians, the elderly, women and children, as well as hospitals, churches, and UN areas. The parties also attacked humanitarian aid supplies, and many cities were laid waste after the attacks. The university town of Malakal, where I taught students funded by a NORAD project in northern South Sudan in 2011, was completely destroyed. Already a year after the outbreak of the conflict, several thousand had died, and almost 2 million people had been forced to flee. The UN has later reported serious human rights violations on civilians on all sides of the conflict, which indicate war crimes and crimes against humanity. In 2016, there was a kind of reconciliation between Kiir and Machar, again became the vice president of the coalition government. Although there have been some ceasefires since 2013, and a peace agreement was signed in both 2015 and 2018, there are still acts of war in the country. The civil war has made it very difficult to produce food and has made it dangerous to provide assistance to vulnerable groups. In addition, the corona pandemic and large flood-prone areas have made the situation even worse. Aid organizations warn of an extreme famine. The UN expects over 8 million in need of humanitarian relief this year. As was mentioned, it's estimated that 400,000 people have been killed since the war. 1.6 million are internally displaced, and around 2.2 million South Sudanese today are refugees in neighboring countries, including 1 million in Uganda. Following the peace agreement in 2018, several mechanisms were established to deal with human rights violations in the country. For example, the Commission for Truth, Healing and Reconciliation, CTRH. But neither the CTRH nor the other mechanisms have yet been implemented. In December 2020, a report from a steering group was published, and the report writes that it's quite obvious that this dysfunctional government cannot deliver the peace, security, and stability that the country desperately needs, and demanded that President Kiir and Vice President Machar should step down. Unfortunately, there is nothing to suggest that the two who are responsible for the violations of the Geneva Convention's prohibition of torture, the use of child soldiers, and attacks on civilian targets intend to give up their positions. The Troika, the US, the UK, and Norway, is also very harsh in its verdict and claims that economic security, human rights, and humanitarian crisis in the country is caused by the political leaders with Kiir and Machar at the helm. At the same time, the UN Sanctions Committee has compiled a list of people responsible for some of the worst war crimes in South Sudan, calling for the seizure of the property of these people and the seizure of money that they illegally have placed in banks in the region. Not long ago, there was also a letter from several generals asking the president to leave. A new report from the UN Security Panel for South Sudan this week warns of a new war. It reports of internal power struggles in Juba, where Kiir and Machar have lost a lot of support, and where the power struggles are generating conflicts elsewhere in the country. Last but not the least, the South Sudanese government has finally, in January 2021, approved the process of establishing a hybrid court under the African Union after a long and protracted process. It was decided that the court should be established as early as 2015 under the 2015 Agreement on the Resolution of the Conflict in the Republic of South Sudan. But getting it approved by the South Sudanese government took almost 6 years. The court is supposed to examine and bring justice to individuals responsible for violations of international South Sudanese law. I harbor no belief that the hybrid court, which is to be a collaboration between the African Union and the South Sudanese government, will bring the leaders to justice. The only outcome that is certain is that it will take many years of still unimaginable sufferings for the people of South Sudan if we leave the case to this hybrid court. As Amnesty writes, no prospects of accountability in South Sudan. And what does the average South Sudanese, often without a job and without schooling, at least 65% are illiterate, what do they want to do? In a country without a viable democracy, we don't have representative surveys. But qualitative research, for example, from informants in Juba, found the following on one of the questions: what forms should justice take? Most of the informants replied, we want the ICC, or we want the court that is outside South Sudan. I've been in touch with leading opposition politicians in South Sudan lately, and with ordinary South Sudanese, both in the country and in the diaspora. And they seem to agree that they want to lift the situation out of South Sudan and to the UN and possibly to the ICC. Norway's commitment to South Sudan stretches all the way back to the 60s. And the country is one of the main recipients of Norwegian aid. Since Norway now has a seat in the Security Council, it is in my opinion, it is my opinion that Norway has a moral and political responsibility to try to get South Sudan and its leaders on the map in the UN Security Council, and possibly later transfer the case to the ICC, and not wait for the hybrid court. The possibilities for such moves will be discussed in this webinar. As Amnesty International wrote as early as in 2019, unless the hybrid court comes into place quickly, the Security Council must take the necessary and appropriate steps to hold those who have committed criminal acts in South Sudan accountable. We will hear what the experts say about Amnesty's claims tonight. It is the suffering of the common South Sudanese and the fact that South Sudan is already in ruins that makes it imperative for us who have raised the issue in Norway to demand that the situation gets out of the year-long quagmire in which South Sudan is. People are desperate and they ask for external help. And let me finally ask Salva Kiir and Riek Machar and the other warlords in absentia, with reference to the philosopher Hannah Arendt. How can you overcome the pity by which all normal men are affected in the presence of physical suffering? How can you love the suffering and deaths of your people just in order to stick to power and wealth? The task to hold the leaders accountable is a formidable task. But as Nelson Mandela optimistically said, it always seems impossible until it is done. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The next one is Tom Christiansen. He is a journalist and author, and best known as an experienced and long-time African correspondent for the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. From 2006 to 2008, Christiansen was an advisor to South Sudan's President, Salva Kiir. So please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much and good evening. All countries call themselves democratic. Congo-Kinshasa is a democratic republic. Even Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe and its worst was a democratic republic. And the proof was very simple: free and fair elections. When I came to Juba in 2006 as an advisor for the president, it was to create a democracy. But there were hardly any Democrats around. The staff at the president's office had hardly any experience from democratic structures. The commanders knew everything about warfare and arms, but they have never tried the game of democracy. Now they were employed as minister and civil servants. And more of the civil servants behaved like SPLM members than neutral bureaucrats. It was a kind of Soviet style. When the government was established in 2006, people from all over the world came to Juba. Humanitarian staffs came to build schools and run clinics. UN came with their bureaucrats to set up organizations, peacekeepers to control the peace. South Sudanese returned from exile with academic degrees, ready to rule the country. They came with experience from democratic practice at international universities and humanitarian organizations. They all returned to the nation of nothing. Ministries were hardly equipped with educated people. The staff was a number at the diagram of the wall. There was nobody, there were nobody. And who was running this democracy? Was it the government or was it UN or the NGOs? Is it possible to establish a democracy in a country with 4 kilometers of tar roads? The answer is halfway no. South Sudan was a country with pockets of people that never met. Internet and smartphones were hardly existing in the countryside. The ministers kept in touch with each other by hotmail.com. The TV station covered just Juba. Newspapers were local, and governors around the country had nobody to consult. Lack of communications, like roads and newspapers, prevented the people to be a part of the nation. They were just Dinkas or Nuers. What kept them together was an enemy, and now the Khartoum has gone. I remember the president went public on the issue of corruption. He said, there will be zero tolerance on corruption. But the main problem was to find policemen that could read and write. How to investigate corruption when the police officers hardly could count. South Sudan was missing everything. But I came quickly to the discovery of another problem. Democracy is much more than holding free and fair elections. Democracy is more than writing a nice constitution. Democracy grows up from a field of thousands of flowers and plants. The institutions must be there to exercise the decisions that are being made. And other institutions are needed to do the research and give advice before decisions are made. The press must investigate misbehavior and corruption and inform the public on what decisions mean for them. We had a police force, but no proper law. Judges hardly took the chance to execute the law if it went against government interests. South Sudan had press freedom, but journalists knew they would be beaten up by the police if they were covering a demonstration. Or politicians would make the journalist's life hell if they published what they knew. Without national newspaper and other forms of news distribution, democracy could not work. People didn't know what had been decided, and they knew nothing about the debate and alternatives. Without an educated population, politics is for the elite, the few. The international society has its clear recipe for South Sudan, multi-party democracy, full stop. But hardly any tried to define what type of democracy that was needed and possible to establish. Democracy is a universal idea, but the models comes in many forms. In the wave of democracy in Africa in the beginning of the 90s, dictators were swept out and replaced by democratically elected presidents and parliaments. But how democratic was that transfer? The Commonwealth administration in London assisted all its members with legal advice and drafts for new constitution, but all of them were based on the British Westminster model, where the winner takes it all. It worked for UK, but not for Africa. European political parties are based on ideology from red to blue. African parties more on ethnicity and local geography. In Zimbabwe, for example, with one small and one big ethnic group, the Shonas got most of the seats in parliament, while the Ndebeles hardly got any representation. The former president of Ghana, Jerry Rawlings, reminded Western observers of a forgotten lesson. Africa had its democratic traditions before the white man came. The old men under the acacia trees discussed the tricky issues until they found a common solution, the consensus. The colonial powers introduced the political parties when they left. That thinking cut through the African fragile system based on finding the truth together, as Rawlings said. That old tradition was tried again when Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk met over a green draped table outside Johannesburg in 1990 to end apartheid and give South Africa a new democratic constitution. Both had the veto right. Both could stop the other. Therefore, it took 4 years. Therefore, they made world's most. Yeah, I was just saying, and I'm about to close, that the public is not a part of the rule of the nation of South Sudan, and there is no public influence that moves the positions or shake the big men. The people of South Sudan are not a part of the political development. They are just hungry onlookers. Many leaders globally has experienced the fall from power, not only because of their mistakes, but on how they handled the cover-up and the media. South Sudan, with its fragile democracy, doesn't have that critical media, doesn't have the vibrant environment with critical interest groups, doesn't know the investigative journalism or feel the heat from a functional opposition. A basic element in every democracy is the respect for the law, and that the law is for everybody. That is crucial for a new nation coming out of a brutal civil war. How to get to terms with the past. In South Sudan, both the president and the vice president are accused of genocide and war crimes. What will South Sudan do with that? The massacre in Bor in 1991 involving Riek Machar. Is it to be forgotten? The act of government troops December 2013 directed against the Nuer population in Juba, was that a genocide? And was the president responsible? The answers on these questions can only be answered by a court. The International Criminal Court is the address for these questions. And if not, South Sudan must bring its leader for own courts. Or will there be an amnesty, a reconciliation process? If so, it's unthinkable without a hearing to unveil the misdeeds. I have not seen any serious will or initiative in that direction in South Sudan. And without a decision to face legal rights, democratic standards are just empty promises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move on to Regina Guy, who is originally from South Sudan and a lawyer with a master's degree in public international law from University of Oslo. She is a diplomat and a former deputy head of the South Sudan embassy in Nairobi, Kenya. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. I would also speak briefly to add for the first commentator and the second one, whatever they have said, I'll just add a little bit. I will speak as an insider from my experience there. We can clearly see that South Sudan as a nation has failed to the minimum to protect the interests of its citizens and also to bring the integrity of the community and to bring justice. There is no rule of law in South Sudan, as we have seen, which has caused all of these problems which are happening inside the new nation. The leadership of South Sudan's kleptocrats in powers whose ideology is to destroy the destiny of South Sudanese people in one way or another. The situation of South Sudan is an empty shell completely. People of South Sudan, they have given up, they are defeated, they have no choice but to rise up if they want a better future for their children. Otherwise, they will remain in abyss. The SPLM as a party has become the problem of South Sudan. Without removing SPLM, the problem of South Sudan will not come to an end. People are hiding behind the party to commit human rights and do the unthinkable. SPLM actually was built on impunity, and people believe that those who are in the war, who participated in the war, they are the people who have the right to be in the government or to deal with the resources of country the way they want. People like us who have gone from here, from the diaspora, to go and participate in building the democracy in South Sudan, we were isolated and sidelined, just simply because they believe we did not participate in independence of the country. So SPLM people in the leadership, they had no vision or plan, as Tom Christensen has said. They had no vision or plan how to govern the country. They think that the country is their hard-earned resources, as I've said, and they should not be questioned on how they spend the money of the country, and there should be no accountability at all. If you question them, you will become the enemy of the state and you will be gotten rid of. If we remove Salva Kiir and Riek Machar alone will not be the solution for South Sudan, because if SPLM is still there, whoever will come after also will make the same problem, or maybe even worse, because they have that mentality. The parliament in South Sudan is dead, with no credible mandate. The members are handpicked puppets who are bribed or paid on patronage for their livelihood. Therefore, they have no credibility to pass any legislation which might solve the problem in the country. On a daily basis, security South Sudanese people are killed, and the sign of arrest and abuses of human rights everywhere. People are killed, kidnapped. There is no democracy. There is no rule of law, as I've said. The opposition members are kidnapped from different countries, the neighboring countries. They are brought and arrested. Some of them are even killed. There is also the issue of lack of accountability. The financial syndicate, criminal syndicate, the money of South Sudan are not kept in the national coffers of South Sudan. There is no transparency. What they do with the resources of the oil, once the oil, the crude is exported, the money which is supposed to come to the country, it comes through central bank of neighboring country, either Khartoum or Egypt. That money is directly taken as cash to be brought to Juba, and it doesn't go to central bank or the Ministry of Finance. It goes direct to the state house. In the state house, there the money will be distributed among them. The security institution or the chief of the security are the main abettors of these financial crimes. What they do, they control, there is no actually budget. It has been almost 2 years now. The budget can be, even last year, there was no budget which has been declared for the country of South Sudan, but they can just say that there is, but in practical, the institution of government, they find nothing to be done. So people go without payment, the civil servants for years or months, even the organized forces. These people in the state house, they decide how to distribute the resources of the country, the revenue of the oil and the gum Arabic, which is coming from Rome. They decide and they send a list to the Ministry of Finance who to be given the money and which ministry should be given. Otherwise, it's very difficult. Also, the issue of the contract supply to the client, there are particular business people who are always getting supplies. These people are their friends and they give them the contract on dubious way. Sometimes there is nothing which is paid and the contract is there and the money is being spent. Basically spending the money without giving any services to the people. As I said, the rampant insecurity is there. There is militia also. Everybody in South Sudan, basically. These are all the sources of this. They are linked memo, which I have with me. So these are the reference. And also the reports of human rights are there and the UN expert also last century report. In Upper Nile State, the insecurity is so much so people are killed based on their tribal affiliation and their disposal of their land. The same thing in Central Equatoria where people are disposed and there is a lot of land grabbing and there is killing on the highway and so forth. The international community and the UN who supply the essential communities are humiliated, their local staffs are killed on every day, and nobody condemns from both sides of the partners to the agreement. So the question is this peace of 2018, is it really working? Is it viable? Because people say that there is a unity government now and we wait the peace will come to South Sudan. It has almost been 3 years since 2018 and there is nothing which is working. The speculation is that maybe the partners to the peace, Riek Machar might have been bribed or threatened, nobody knows, but there is nobody talking. And it has been seen also that there is no transparency among the peace partners and no political will from the government to genuinely implement the peace. Another thing also, which is very important for the peace, chapter 2 of the agreement, which is the security arrangement, have not been implemented. The cantonment side, the opposition forces are the ones who were there, and there is problem of lack of fund and essential military provision. No food and no medicine. The soldiers are in disarray. Some of them are starved and killed so they can depart and the war resumes. There have been breaches of fire or ceasefire, mainly from the government, and no national army yet, and no graduation of forces. Another thing also for chapter 1 of the peace, which is the National Transition Assembly, which has not been formed until now. That means there is no parliament which is working in South Sudan, and it has been over a year. That is affecting citizens in way of there's no budget, and the living is very hard and economic is also people are suffering. And there is no reform also which has been done. And then again, another setback is there is also lack of the permanent constitution, which is supposed to be out by now, which will facilitate way for free and fair election has not been done. So there was a workshop which was supposed to take place in January and February this year, 2018, which was supposed to be sponsored by Joint Monetary Commission and Max Planck Foundation, but it failed to take place because it was boycotted by the government delegate. This workshop could have been very critical for implementation of legislation which would have guided the writing of permanent constitution, which could have led to the election. So what is the way forward since this peace has not worked or is not even going to work the way it looks? The way forward, I would say that removing of Selfa and Riek Machar and the head of security, who are the people who are causing problems in South Sudan because they don't care about South Sudan people. All of them, the constitution holders who don't care, the minister or whoever who are involved should be removed and should be banned from future participation in the government of South Sudan because they pose a security risk for the people. And the president, as the president of the country, he should be held in the future responsible and the commander's responsibility for criminal liability, which falls under him. The crime which were committed was his responsibility, but he chose to keep quiet and ignore. So, regardless, he has been informed several times by the local media and international media and Human Rights Watch. All they have been brought into his attention that there's massive violation of human rights which are happening, but he chose to keep quiet and to ignore it. 3, another alternative is also to establish a caretaker government of technocrats with the help of United Nations, Troika, and African Union and European Union. And IGAD should be excluded also from participating, but because IGAD has a vested interest in South Sudan. The neighboring countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia have vested interest in South Sudan. They are not impartial to take part in this process. This technocrat government, its mandate shall be to convene a national convention, where the outcome of convention will be text and principle, which will be submitted to enactment to guide the process of making the permanent constitution, which will lead to free and fair election. They will carry out the census, and also they will make some reform, like for example, reforming the national security, which is very vital because they are main abettors of the human rights violation in South Sudan. They deal with impunity. Nobody is concerned about them. The third one, implementation of transitional justice mechanism. That is truth and reconciliation and hybrid court. I suggest that hybrid court should be established or should be taken to Arusha, since we have the facilities already there, which was there for the Rwanda tribunal. So this is already made. It will be very good, and it will be also good because people will be very free to testify and all of that. So, and then also accountability for human rights. Who has been implicated in violation of human rights, maybe should be held responsible for war crime and crime against humanity. The government or opposition, their forces and their militias should be accountable for war crime, because this crime was committed as part of widespread attack and systematic upon the civilian. Also, Obasanjo report of 2014 should be also implemented. And lastly, cessation of funds or loans to South Sudan. As we know, South Sudan has been receiving money from IMF and from European Union and from US. So we wonder, how come they're giving money to South Sudan? South Sudan is a fragile post-conflict nation. And all the partners are aware that mainly the obstacle to the peace or implementation of the peace has been this government, mainly because they have the upper hand. So all the partners are aware of that. So there is no need of sending money again or pouring money into South Sudan if they want South Sudan to have a better future, because this money empowers the government and it jeopardizes the peace. So if they want to give money to South Sudan, they should wait until the reform is done, because there are no institutions, financial institutions in South Sudan, they don't exist at all, or they are not reformed. The finance ministry is the finance minister of South Sudan. There is no strong policy for microeconomics, no reform in place. Yet there is a lot of disparities between the bank's exchange rate and the real market in South Sudan. South Sudan has no capacity to pay back this loan until change in further circumstances. You can see the civil servants and organized forces are not being paid. The life is very hard. These are part of the criminal activities. Okay, all the oil revenue which are spent by the clique within the government, it will go, all of this loan will go directly to their pocket because it's physical cash and there is no need for it. The better approach is to empower the investment activities instead of financial loan until further reform is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you. We now move on to the last speaker in the panel, and that is Cecilia Hellestveit. All right, Cecilia is a lawyer and a political scientist with a doctorate in international law's rules for civil wars. Last year, she co-authored a book on krigens folkerett, Norge og vår tids kriger. And Hellestveit is currently working on a book on negotiation processes in international law. So please, Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to you about the mechanisms of accountability and the prospects for bringing an end to impunity for the atrocities that have been committed in South Sudan in the past decade. Now, the subject of my intervention is accountability for international crimes committed in South Sudan. The hybrid tribunal has a plan of a mixed legislation, including both crimes committed under Sudanese law and international crimes. Now, I will exclusively focus on international crimes that have been committed in the period from 2013 and in a span that actually goes beyond 2018. I speak from the perspective of international law and look at the possibilities. What are the current avenues of bringing South Sudanese leaders to account for these atrocities? Now, and I have to so there are three relevant elements. First of all, the norms. What are the international norms that the South Sudanese state, the armed actors, and the individuals are responsible under? The second is, what are the mechanisms and procedures that actually can function? And the third is, of course, the specific situation of the South Sudan. As I proceed now, I will present first the norms and then the institutions, and in parallel refer to the specific situation of South Sudan. And eventually I will end by a few observations on the way forward, coming back to Anders' initial questions. Now, the agreement of 2018 stated that sustainable peace can only be achieved through accountability for serious international crimes, basically modeling the same chapter that had already been included in the 2015 agreement. Now, it had, in Article 5.3, called for the establishment of a hybrid court for South Sudan to investigate and prosecute individuals responsible for violations of international law and or applicable South Sudanese law. And the tribunal's mandate will include atrocities committed that includes genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, which are what we call international crimes. Now, these crimes apply to all persons everywhere on the planet at all times in terms of the norms. Now, in terms of the mechanisms, can you be held accountable? Now, that is a different question. But serious international crimes include human rights abuses committed as a part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population, which is crimes against humanity. And this is explicit in the ICC statute. Now, even though the South Sudanese are not a member state of the ICC statute, that is not about the norms. It is about the process. So in terms of the norms, all South Sudanese individuals are bound to respect these norms. Now, who can be held to account for these violations? Now, first and foremost, human rights abuses are restrictions intended for the government authorities. But non-state actors, rebel groups who exercise authority over populations, they can also be held accountable for crimes against humanity. So basically, in a civil war, both sides or all sides that are parties to the armed conflict. Now, when we move over to the war crimes, these are serious violations of humanitarian law amounting to war crimes under the Geneva Conventions, under customary law, and the ICC statute. Now, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the UN Commission on Human Rights, in its 2018 report, concluded that international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, applies to South Sudan from January 2014 and beyond 2018. And this is an important thing because in some other civil wars, there has been an argument that after the peace agreement has been entered into, then the war crimes end. And that means that in some processes, we have seen that there is this loop, this hole or loophole where certain crimes that would be international crimes yesterday, today, because of this peace agreement, cannot be prosecuted as such. Now, the ICRC and the UN Commission, they have basically made sure that this is not going to be a problem in South Sudan. Now, in 2019, the ICC statute had an additional crime, which is the starvation as a method of war in civil wars. This was not an international crime under the statute before 2019. Now, of course, this is the question, can that be applied retroactively to crimes committed 5 years ago? This might be a problem, but it is really a minor one. So who can be held accountable for war crimes? Military commanders, political leaders belonging to a party to an armed conflict, both state and non-state actor. Now, lastly, of course, there is the genocidal, the crime of genocide, which are acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, and racial or religious group as such. Now, this is both in the Genocide Convention in the ICC statute. And all political and military leaders of state or non-state actors can be held accountable. So basically, in the final report of the South Sudanese National Dialogue Steering Committee that came out in December of 2020, if you look at the description of the atrocities being committed, ethnic hatred, brutality by government and rebel forces, rapes, mutilation, killings with impunity, including mutilation of fetuses, burning of people in churches and mosques, these descriptions, they amount at least to war crimes and or crimes against humanity, and potentially also to acts of genocide. Now, the Commission on Human Rights for South Sudan, which was established in 2016 as a fact-finding entity under the Human Rights Council, has basically labeled the South Sudanese conflict an inter-ethnic conflict. And it is tasked with gathering evidence and preparation for accountability mechanisms. So there is a lot of evidence by now. And when they gather evidence, they make sure to have those procedural requirements that will be needed to take a case before the ICC eventually, if that were to happen. Now, they have put out yearly reports from 2017 until 2021, and they recently had their mandate extended. And in 2020, the year after the ICC statute had introduced starvation as a method of war, as a war crime also in civil wars, they also made a special report on starvation used as the method of war in the South Sudanese conflict. So there is a lot of evidence for international crimes being committed. Now, one last thing about the genocide issue. There is recently a scholarly book that came out alleging that the ethnic violence in the South Sudan amounts to genocide. Clémence Pinault of the Cornell University Press in a very thorough scholarly work entitled War and Genocide in South Sudan that came out in 2021. Now, does this matter whether you call it genocide or not? No, it doesn't. At this point in time, when you have a transitional process already, the G word does not really move stones. But in general, in South Sudan, the norms represent minor obstacles for accountability compared to internationalized civil wars that we have, for instance, in Syria and in Yemen, where some of the norms is basically a major challenge. This is not the case for the civil war in South Sudan. Now, the institutional, the mechanisms, that is where the challenges arises for accountability in South Sudan. What levels can bring leaders to account? Now, national authorities, also in civil wars, they have what we call primary jurisdiction. So they basically have the strongest right. Secondary jurisdiction, meaning that they will have right as long as the first jurisdiction is not used, is the international organizations. Now, the UN Security Council and potentially also the African Union and third countries, such as Norway, could also potentially prosecute international crimes or South Sudanese citizens in Norway for these crimes being committed in South Sudan, if the South Sudanese individuals were to find themselves in Norway. But these international organizations and the third countries, they have what we call secondary jurisdiction. It only applies if national authorities are unable or unwilling to bring those responsible to justice. And this is an important thing to understand, because these primary and secondary jurisdictions, they interact. So in order, if the South Sudanese have a process of accountability, of legal accountability for international crimes, these other processes, they are to some extent put on hold. So their function is first and foremost to put pressure on the primary mechanism. Now, what are the institutions that can bring leaders to account? Now, of course, the national tribunals that you can have for this purpose, or regionally, or also internationally supported hybrid mixed tribunals that are based not on the UN Security Council or an international institution, but that have their legitimacy in a decision by the national authorities. Very often a war, a peace agreement, such as the 2018 agreement. Now, this is an exercise of the primary jurisdiction of bringing South Sudanese to account. Now, what happens in South Sudan is, of course, that there is an unwillingness. This is what happens in almost every civil war. There is an unwillingness to introduce these types of legal processes. In South Sudan, there is also an inability. So there is a combination of both. Now, the African Union, as you know, in 2014, established the Commission of Inquiry for South Sudan, and this led eventually to what became Chapter 5 in the peace agreements of 2015 and 2018, suggesting a hybrid tribunal. Now, this is a tribunal that has its basis in South Sudan jurisdiction, so it's primary jurisdiction, but with the assistance of the African Union. So it is primary jurisdiction. Now, what does that mean? What institutions can bring leaders to account for international crimes at the international level? Now, the International Criminal Court. South Sudan, as you know, is not a member of the International Criminal Court. This means that the prosecutor in The Hague does not have jurisdiction to initiate cases. So if you were to bring a case to The Hague tomorrow, the prosecutor will say, I do not have jurisdiction. Now, what is important is to know that if South Sudan had been a member of the ICC with the hybrid tribunal, which is a tribunal of primary jurisdiction, which is a more forceful instrument, the prosecutor of the ICC would have to say, I have to wait. I have to wait and see what they are doing. Now, if they are not doing their job, then I will have jurisdiction. Now, one exception is dual citizens, South Sudanese, who have a dual citizenship, and they may be half South Sudanese and half French. Now, in that case, the French jurisdiction can give the prosecutor a right to go after these persons. However, again, this primary jurisdiction trap is still there. Now, the United Nations Security Council has power to transfer South Sudan to the ICC under the UN Charter, Chapter 7, and the ICC statute. Now, the Security Council has done this before, as you know. So in 2005, the UN Security Council decided to transfer the Sudan situation to the ICC. But when the South Sudanese seceded in 2011, the ICC jurisdiction was brought to a halt and is not relevant at all for the current war. Now, if the Security Council were to transfer South Sudan to the ICC, what will then happen? That would still be secondary jurisdiction, because the prosecutor would also have to wait and look and see what the hybrid tribunal would do. Now, once the hybrid tribunal did not do as it is supposed to, the prosecutor could act. Okay, so this then seems like we are in a kind of a loop, but it is not that bleak. Now, the UN system has a fact-finding instrument for South Sudan that was established in 2016. And it is very important not to mix these fact-finding instruments with the UN rapporteurs or the Human Rights Committee and so forth, because this type of UN instrument can potentially have a lot of impact.
Could you please conclude?
Yeah, I am concluding now.
Sorry,
now they can gather evidence and veil over the process. In 2020, they made a conference room paper called Transitional Justice and Accountability, a roadmap for sustainable peace in South Sudan. And they are basically presenting a roadmap with benchmarks for the implementation of the tribunal or the hybrid tribunal. And as you know, in January of this year, the South Sudanese government decided to establish this legislation. So the point of the Commission on Human Rights, they can serve to confirm that primary jurisdiction does not work. And that increases the pressure and expectations and freedom of action of the UN Security Council, because this commission kind of reports directly to the UN Security Council. And then I come to my final observation. Civil war still represents major challenges for international justice. And because you remove the political and military leaders that are engaged, are the primary actors in the peace process and transitional processes. And therefore, in civil wars, we always see accountability mechanisms late in the process. Secondly, international criminal law is coming of age. Now, does that help us? Sudan and Darfur in the 20s, the report, the cessation report about atrocities in Darfur was enough to make the Security Council transfer Sudan to the ICC. And the objective was to ensure accountability at some point. Now, this, as you know, is a process that is still going on today. It has proceeded from 2005, but it is still a process which is ongoing. Now, if you look at the difference with South Sudan in the 2020s, the atrocities are now known, evidence has been gathered. Now, the UN fact-finding reports is not about the atrocities, but about the progress of the hybrid court, about the type of justice mechanisms that the South Sudanese have in their own peace process. So if this is slow or inadequate, it may prompt UN Security Council action. So that means that we have to look at this in a slightly different way, because now the transitional justice process is being watched over by the UN Security Council. And at some point, if it slows down, the UN Security Council can transfer it to the International Court of Justice. And you should not be fooled by the kind of geopolitical blocking that we have in Syria, for instance, for such a transfer. That would probably not apply in the same way to South Sudan, would be my analysis.
Okay. Yeah.
So basically that
Thank
is
you very much.
my conclusion, that international justice is slow, very frustrating, but we do have the power to ensure accountability eventually.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So we start now with Hilde Frafjord Jonsson, She has been the US Special Envoy to South Sudan and former Minister of Development Aid in 2 governments, both headed by Kjell Magne Bondevik. She has also been Deputy Director in UNICEF, and it's a tall call, I know, but the idea is that you have 5 minutes. So please say that, the floor is yours.
That's okay, I'll try to manage within it. After having worked on both Sudan and South Sudan for 25 years, I'll still try to limit it. I'm happy to come in if there's questions. I'll build on what others have been saying. After we have seen the developments up to now, I'll kind of take now as a point of departure. We are in a no peace, no war situation in South Sudan. I will characterize the situation currently with 3 points. Firstly, the situation in the country is worse than it ever has been, in my view, since Sudan's independence. That means since 1956. What has happened at the hands of the South Sudanese themselves is worse than what occurred under successive Khartoum regimes. That's mind-boggling, but I believe it's true. Number 2, the most paradoxical in this is that the current South Sudanese leadership has adopted the Khartoum playbook. So the methodology that they use to abuse and oppress South Sudanese, they are now using against their own people. And it's systematic, and it's particularly visible in national security and the way national security operates, but it's also visible in the way a war is being conducted and in the way people are treated. So the playbook is repeated by the oppressed, former oppressed, now oppressing others and their own people. Thirdly, the people of South Sudan, and it follows from the 2 former, have been betrayed by their leaders across all factions. No one is exempted, in my view. This doesn't only go for the corruption that we've seen, that Regina was talking about, the conflict and insecurity that has been perpetrated, but in my view, they're now also responsible for what I'm seeing as the implosion of the already extremely weak and fragile South Sudanese state. There is now, and that the latter is particularly a responsibility of the president, of Salva Kiir, and his closest group of people. The implosion affects all institutions that are now almost totally dysfunctional. This is also what Regina was mentioning. And so those 3 points, in my view, is the status at this, and you can say much more, but that's the highlights for me, or the lowlights rather. But then, very important point right now is that the situation is thus that the 2 on the top, meaning Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, has rightly been identified as perpetrators and responsible people. But what is important to know is that they are now both increasingly isolated and almost isolated, with only their staunchest supporters left to defend them. So they're almost there alone, but they're there with the use of the power they have. Riek Machar is really weak, so he doesn't really have power, but Salva Kiir is almost also alone. So it's a very peculiar situation. Now, what is the South Sudanese? To then the point on democracy, then I'll come to the point on the implications of that, and then accountability. So the South Sudanese themselves, as several have been touching upon, has in a way come out with their views through the national dialogue process. But I wanted to say one word about the process itself, because there is no democracy in South Sudan, absolutely none. But the national dialogue really was a process with all its fault lines, problems, attempts at manipulation, still one of the more consultative and democratic discussion forums that we've seen in South Sudan. And the fact that the end report ended up with a clear recommendation from the people, and they consulted all over in all communities, in all corners of the country, they concluded very clearly, as has been referred to by other speakers, that both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar should step aside. This is a very courageous point to make by the conclusive steering committee, but it comes out of consultations with millions of South Sudanese. But there is no willingness to listen to the people, as has been said by others. And so let me then move to what that means in terms of of the current situation. As there is no democratic process, as Regina said, the parliament is not functional. Actually, the parliament that was supposed to come out of the rigid peace agreement following after 2018, that parliament has been sitting but is no longer functional. Now, Kiir was supposed to appoint a new one, which was more inclusive. He has not done that. And the question is why? And I would like to give you a guess, because in 2018, Kiir was extended for 3 years. By whom? By the parliament. He was accepted as a legitimate president at the time, and that recognition was accepted by the international community. They kind of gave him 3 years extension despite the former peace agreements, which means that he could continue to rule up to now. The end date is 9th July 2021. So it's a very short time from now. Why has the president not appointed the parliament? I think we can all guess. My assumption is that he would like to use the current parliament, which is dysfunctional, but still could be convened, in particular if they get some funds to do so, meaning payment. Then the president could be extended again, upon which he could then appoint the new parliament. And the reason why I'm raising this issue is the question is then, what will the African Union, IGAD, and the international community do in such a scenario? And it's really important because this is linked to the current equation in South Sudan. A couple of other speakers were mentioning the increasing insecurity. I wanted to highlight not only the intercommunal violence, which is escalating all over the country, but there is actually major troop movements into Juba. And there is a lot of tension, not only out in the countryside, but in the center of itself. And the question is, what is going to happen in the next weeks up to the 9th of July? What we need to be aware of is the risk that things can escalate further, that the political tensions around this transition or non-transition can be really, really hot. And the question is whether it will be under control or get out of control. So this is a really tenuous situation. Then a few words about accountability. Several people have been touching upon that. So I just wanted to make one comment following from what Cecilia said, which is as the African Union / South Sudan hybrid court process is not only slow, but also probably unrealistic in terms of its implementation. I think it's very good that the UN is looking at the process issues and can conclude after an assessment whether this is actually adequate and will imply sufficient primary jurisdiction or not. So then the question is, if the conclusion is no, and it is raised with the Security Council, what happens then? I mean, the Security Council could, of course, tell the AU that we'll give you another chance if you can pull it off within a deadline or something. But if they have concluded firmly that this is not the case, then we are in a situation that the Security Council has to make a decision. My assessment is, and maybe I'm slightly, it would be interesting to hear Cecilia's or others' views on that, but China and Russia has normally up to now supported South Sudan in the Council quite a lot. The Security Council, of course, has South Sudan on its agenda, but it's on the basis of reports from UNMISS. And those reports are the ones that are being reviewed in addition to the UN panel of experts reports that several have been referring to. Normally, China and Russia have not wanted to do anything that the African Union is not recommending in the Council. This does not go only for South Sudan, it goes for almost all African countries. So unless the AU recommends it, the Russians and the Chinese are normally saying no. This is the case in many, many situations. So I think we are in a situation where it can still be blocked in the Council, and that the divided Council can prevent this from moving forward. So I don't want to make any kind of conclusive assessments of it, but it remains to be seen. I think the fact that South Sudan is not given any attention, neither internationally nor here in Norway, is a big problem. I think both the issue about what can happen in the coming next few weeks up to the 9th of July, there needs to be a careful monitoring of the situation, and possible actions have to be planned by the region or the international community. I think the fact that it's not visible in any way anywhere, I think also undermines the pressure on accountability. So that's another problem. And I think thirdly, the fact that the region is full of problems by themselves. Ethiopia, Uganda, Sudan makes it really hard for them to take a leading role in this situation. We're also seeing a weaker Troika engagement that we've seen before. So there's a lot of problems related to international engagement that I think affect South Sudan negatively. So in this situation, which is so risky, my concluding point will be, if there is one point in time we cannot leave South Sudan at the wayside and not keep our eyes on the country, it is actually now. We really need to monitor and follow up and do our best to see what can be done to engage. And if not for anything else, the security of the country can implode further. It can become even more violent. We can see a worse situation than 2013 if we don't act. And so for me, it's not only about security, it's also about the people who have suffered more than anyone almost that we can imagine on this planet. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hilde. Thank you. We move on. Marit Harnes. She is leader of the support group for Sudan and South Sudan. Harnes had several international assignments for the United Nations Refugee Agency, FNs Høykommissær for flyktninger, for UNICEF, and for Norwegian People's Aid in South Sudan and Sudan. So please, Marit, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. One thing, for one, Norway is part of the Troika, and has been deeply involved in pushing for the last peace agreement in 2018. Is it likely to believe that Norway will sort of step out of the Troika and bring this case into the Security Council as the situation is now? We know the Troika is now coming out with a new statement that they are trying once again to push hard on the parties to implement the peace agreement. But Cecilia said their own peace agreement. Is it really their own peace agreement? This came after a long process of pushing the parties. And as Hilde mentioned, the political interest and political knowledge in Norwegian political parties has never been less, which is also something that speaks against what we are talking about. But when we talk about this peace agreement, we are saying that this summer we are going to celebrate 10 years of independence for South Sudan. What are we to celebrate? As Hilde said, the situation has never been worse. I was there during the war before 2006. It was better than what is now. So, and also like Regina said, there is nothing in place, not the constitution, not the judiciary, nothing. And this peace agreement, has there been a will to implement it behind it at all from the leaders? Because it has taken 4 years. In 10 years, there has been no election. Now it has taken 4 years. And as I can see, the development has not gone in a positive direction. I'm very sad to say this, because it has been many attempts to push for a better direction. And I know that my friends, all over, South Sudanese all over the world, are frustrated, they are angry, and they can't see a way out. They are more pessimistic than ever. Because who is going to take bring this situation from inside to a solution? You are talking about the national dialogue. Yes, the report was harsh. It could have been a starting point. I have a book from the national dialogue. I've read through it. It has every element that could bring it to a success if the will was there. But when we are talking about, as Hilda's saying, we see a situation where is this peace? It's a peace agreement, but there is no peace. There is fighting all over the country. And what people are asking on the ground is actually not democracy. They don't know what the word means, but they are asking for justice. But what do they mean about justice as far as I know? Safe living conditions, basic needs to be provided, and most of all maybe respect and acknowledgement for what they are despite of the tribe. Can we see a way where the international court can be the way out of this? I'm sorry to say I don't see that. But as Hilde is saying, there is a great need for a strong international engagement for the situation not to completely break down. It's going towards a disaster if nothing's done. We have a weapon embargo, but weapon is coming in because some of the fractions really need weapons, because that is the tradition of South Sudan, living with war throughout their lives. That if you are to solve a problem with your neighbor, you do it by fighting. And that is a very strong tradition and sad tradition. And if the only one who wants to replace the sitting leadership is their only aim is to replace the sitting leadership with themselves being just as undemocratic, just striving for power, we will never reach anywhere. I know I'm specifically concerned about the youth, because the youth, they are very frustrated. They have their hopes, they want to do something, but if they do something, we all know what can happen. The disaster can become even worse. If it's not well organized, there is no way out. So this is, as Cecilia is saying, a loop when it comes to the international society, and also within the society itself, it's very hard to see the way out and to see the person or the group that could lead in a good direction that can really bring this country forward. This is not a very positive statement, and I'm very sad to say it like this, because I've followed for so many years and I put so much effort and hopes into this country. And I also have so many friends, young and old, South Sudanese, and my heart is really bleeding for them. And I really want us to do something, but what is the right thing to do? I'm not sure the ICC is the way out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marit. The last commentator is Peter Natana. I hope I pronounced this correctly. He is an independent consultant from South Sudan. He works with democracy building, migration and integration. And he has previously worked for Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights. So please, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator. My thanks to the organizers of this meeting and to the previous speakers. Thank you very much for the elaborate presentations that you have all made. South Sudan is indeed on the brink of collapse. Not only is it on the brink of collapse, but it is heading towards total disintegration. And this can happen sooner than later if it is not rescued. Therefore, the interests of the people of the South Sudan should be put first when we look into the situation of South Sudan. The downward spiraling of the situation in South Sudan towards abyss did not start today. Many speakers have already said it started right from independence, and it is heading fast with a lot of momentum. And this is mostly due to poor leadership and lack of vision for the country by the leaders, and mainly by the SPLM-led party. Not only do the leaders don't have the vision, but also they lack the appetite for institutions that will govern a country or that can form the basis of a nation state. So the people of South Sudan need to be rescued from these leaders themselves, who have over many years brought nothing but misery and suffering and indignation to the people. For South Sudan to be a viable state once again, these leaders, of course, have to be held to justice and accountability for crimes committed against the people of South Sudan. This must be effected whether at the ICC or in the country, in South Sudan, or in the region, as some people have said. And the previous speakers have talked about it, and the people of South Sudan look forward to that. But I think also the people of South Sudan require much more than the hauling of a few leaders to the ICC or to the trial chambers in any court. They look much more to having sustainable peace in the country. South Sudan needs to address the root causes of the conflict. The problem of the country must be addressed from its roots. And that should also be part of the solution to the problem of South Sudan. Justice on one side, yet addressing the root causes of this conflict so that this country continues. The children who are born today, who will be born tomorrow, they will need to live in that country. And they need a country that is stable, a nation to live in. So addressing the root causes can only be achieved through credible political negotiations that have to be supported by the international community. So Norway's position, in as much as it also can work for bringing about justice, should also look into supporting a process of addressing the root causes of the conflict in South Sudan in credible negotiations. Today, the oppositions in South Sudan have been engaged in a process of negotiation in Rome, Italy, and we believe that if the root causes of the conflict, or if the government of South Sudan engage in goodwill to resolve the root causes of the conflict in the country, South Sudan or future generations of South Sudan will see peace, which means we shall rescue this country from the abyss that it is flowing to. It is very clear that to the people of South Sudan and the international community that the agreement is not working. The RRC is dead. It is finished, both by its nature that it did not address the root causes of the conflict of South Sudan, and also by the intentional actions of the partners. So what do we want to see resolved in South Sudan? For South Sudan to be a viable state again, you would have the nationality identity crisis must be resolved in South Sudan. Who are these South Sudanese? What are they? Are we equal? What kind of a country do we want? The ethnic hegemony and political marginalization of other ethnic groups who are not holding the machinery of power must stop in South Sudan. Governance issues must be addressed. Ethno-political territorial occupation and land grabbing issues must be addressed. Repressive ethnic dominated security force that is killing and maiming people all over South Sudan every day with impunity must be addressed. Disregard to constitutionalism and development must be addressed. Corruption, mismanagement must be addressed. If these root causes of the conflict in South Sudan are addressed in credible negotiations and implemented with the help of international partners, there is a future for South Sudan. This, of course, alongside the legal pursuit of justice. And when in the event that a peace agreement is reached, resolving this crisis through addressing the root causes of South Sudan, a national constitutional conference should be convened where all South Sudanese, all stakeholders, political forces, civil societies, church groups, all will have to sit down and chart the way on how do we form the basis of this new nation. What is this country called South Sudan? How can we form a nation state out of these diverse people? The international community should stand behind this, and if it does, that is the way forward. Otherwise, if we continue to talk about the peace agreement now, or continue to say that it can lead to any headway, we will just be flogging a dead horse to get up and start working. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. There are some questions in the chat. I guess the speakers have seen them. And I was just wondering if we just leave it there, that we do not open for questions and comments from the audience, but that you are asked now to take a round and we will start with the speakers in the panel and comment each other if you want to. And then also feel free to pick upon some of the comments that you can read in the chat. So I think we just go back to the beginning and we start with the first speaker. So please, Anders Breidlid, could you, within 2 minutes, summarize what you think is the main outcome of the discussion today? Please, Anders, floor is yours.
I think that is impossible, huh? But and I think there are no easy solutions to this issue, but I think we have had a very nice seminar. And I think as there are no easy solutions, I think to hold leaders accountable is only one step in the right direction. I think one of the big problems in South Sudan is that there is no huge civic social movement. And why is there no big social movement that could push and pressurize the government? Well, when 70% of the population is illiterate and who don't know their rights, then I don't think we will move forward with the inside pressure. So my question is, and I think Cecilia made some good points, the hybrid court was accepted by South Sudan in January 2021, 3 months ago. And it has taken 6 years for them to approve it. Isn't that a proof that they are not moving forward in the way one could expect, and that the whole case should then be transferred to the UN Security Council? I heard Hilde say that not everybody in the Security Council would agree to hold these leaders responsible, China and Russia. So my question is it better that we have this divisive Security Council decision than no decision at all? Is that possible? I don't know. But I've talked to so many people inside and outside South Sudan, And they're all saying that the situation has never been worse and that we need external help. And that's why we have raised this issue. And as I said in my first presentation, the hybrid court is only starting, and it will take many years before they do anything productive. So that's why we want it to be pushed to the UN Security Council, where Norway is a member. And we have been given, or the Foreign Minister of Norway has accepted our wish for a meeting later. And I hope we can use some of the arguments that we have heard today to push the Foreign Ministry to table this case in the Security Council anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Tom Christiansen, please, only 2 minutes.
When I was in Juba in 2006, I met a lot of young people. They had big hopes. These young people are now refugees with their own family, and they have no job. Many of you who participate in this webinar, I have met through the years, and we have been sitting discussing the hope for South Sudan, what's going to happen, what can happen, all the obstacles and all the fantastic things to happen. Now I hear you all say the same. It has been worse. And was it you, Hilde, that said that it was even better during the war? Or was it Marit? I don't remember. I never heard such a pessimistic perspective on these things. But I cling to a little hope from one of us who actually haven't been into the South Sudan environment, and that is Cecilia. She comes from outside, and she presents a few possibilities for go further on this. We have tried all these soft ways with negotiations and humanitarian work. Maybe it's the hard thing that remains now. The hard game with somebody has to face their criminality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Regina, please. Also, hopefully 2 minutes.
Yes,
So we can wrap up.
much I could say. I've said almost everything. But as my colleagues have said, to conclude, I think we need to do something for South Sudan to take action, because we have tried all the other methods and they are not working. Oh, maybe we should go direct to the Security Council, but lobby with the African Union first, since Hilda said it's a problem that the other permanent member will not go along if the African Union has not consented. What I want to say, that I want to emphasize that people of South Sudan are really suffering. You can imagine people have no food sometimes to eat. They live on one meal. Some of them go 2 days or 3 days without food. And there is no money. The salary comes after a very long time, maybe 6 months or 2 years sometimes. Children are on the street, there is no food. Even if that salary comes, it's very little. You can see somebody who is, say for example, a soldier is I don't know, less than $10 a month. So it's not something you can live on, really. It's very difficult. Like for example, if I was in South Sudan, for my position, I would receive $20 a month. So you can imagine the other people. So it's a very desperate situation. So I don't think, why should we go softly on people who don't care, leadership who don't care about their own people? The benchmark of good state, and also to keep your sovereignty as a sovereign state among the nation, you must take care, the first priority, to take care of your people, the population. But if you don't care and you care about yourself, why should we care about them and give them more chance? If there is a way to eliminate them or remove them, then we should do that. I would support that. The judiciary, as Cecilia said, for primary jurisdiction, if they would accept to take care of the hybrid court, I don't think the judiciary in South Sudan are functioning completely. They are not partial and they are not functioning completely. They are not reformed. So this one will be unableness of the state or unwillingness of the state. So this one will not go. And the hybrid court also should be accompanied, the international community should push for it, because if it's left for South Sudanese judicial system or the South Sudanese government, they will not accept, because nobody will shoot themselves in the foot. So this is not possible. So what we need to do is just to hold our hand as international community in general and the African Union, whoever close, and then we take care of this issue. So this is my plea for all of us. But the conference, we have gotten a lot from it, and let us move ahead and pick up what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and then Cecilia, please, final words, about 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I will have one comment to Marit, and then I will concentrate on the comments by Hilde and Anders. Now, coming from the outside, as Tom mentioned, is mostly a liability, but sometimes it can be an advantage. And I hope that precisely in this case, that is what it is. And I will shortly explain to you why. Now, Marit said that I suggested that this was their own process. Now, that is not what I'm suggesting. I am suggesting that that is what the law requires. So law is formalistic. International criminal law, even more so. So whether or not the Sudanese actually owns their own process is irrelevant. If it is a national peace agreement that establishes the process, it is based on national jurisdiction, and that is primary jurisdiction. So it's not a qualitative evaluation. Now, is ICC the solution to these huge problems facing the South Sudanese community? I am certainly not one to suggest so. The ICC can be an avenue in order to bring those most responsible for atrocities to justice. It should not be relied on for much more than what it can carry. So with that caveat, I am going to give my final comment on the prospects of the UN Security Council acting. Now, I very much share Hilde's analysis. It is very difficult currently due to geopolitical rivalries and a lot of other things. Now, the Chinese and the Russians have a tradition of making decisions in Africa that increasingly comply with the African Union and so forth. But in the field of international law and international criminal law, occasionally there are these moments where the case takes traction. And I believe that we might be in such a moment for South Sudan. This is what happened when the UN Security Council in 2005 decided to bring Sudan to the ICC. It was a kind of a surprise moment because it wasn't expected, but it has to do with, at one point, you reach a level of atrocity where the huge states, where you have to appeal to their decency. And this is why I touched upon the war crime of starvation, because that is a crime that is getting traction. In 2018, all the major P5 voted to condemn it. The reason for that was the use in Syria and Yemen and in South Sudan. Now, the prospects for bringing people to justice in Syria and in Yemen for the use of starvation as the method of war is close to zero for technical legal reasons. I see South Sudan as a country where that is a possibility. And this is where the principles of international law and the urge of all major states to show themselves to be that responsible states that have a certain limit for decency, that is when you can have a different dynamic in the Security Council. So my final remark is going to be this. I am somewhat puzzled by the fact that the advocacy groups for ICC procedures or process are not focusing more on the crime of starvation as a method of war in South Sudan, because I think that is where you can have that moment where you can move the international diplomacy and politics, because that is when you have the possibility to kind of raise above politics. And And I see that as perhaps the most promising way of getting the UN security on board on this transitional process. And once you have that, there are several other possibilities as well, as Regina also mentioned. So that would be my final word. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you. This is the last webinar we have in this series on democracy this spring. And for those of you who are interested in other topics than this particular very important topic we are discussing today, we will put up more information on the coming series in August. So with those words, good evening to you all, and thank you.
منبر صوت الشعب، الرأي والرأي الآخر، شعب واحد ووطن واحد.
منبر صوت الشعب، منبر صوت الشعب.